All right, let's talk about a concept called carrying capacity. And carrying capacity can be thought of this way. Think of the ecosystem as a bucket. And in that bucket, we can fit only so much biomass before it overflows. And so if we think